English 2322 audio lecture, Irony in the Canterbury Tales. In the last lecture, I mentioned that the General Prologue is an example of a medieval literary genre known as estates satire. And I mentioned that it's not the only example, that we actually have quite a few other examples from the medieval period, but that the General Prologue is somewhat different from these other examples. I didn't, however, tell you what makes the General Prologue different from other examples of estate satire, what makes it an unusual example of estate satire. And I guess the short answer to that question is the tone of the work. Most of the other estate satires that we've found are very, well, for lack of a better word, direct. In other words, they identify the problems of the three estates in a very explicit way, and often in a very harsh way. These aren't subtle works. They are usually kind of like rants, complaints about the different corruptions of the nobility, the different problems of the clergy, the different abuses of the peasantry, for example. And Chaucer's General Prologue doesn't feel like that at all. In fact, as you were reading the General Prologue, you may have at times sort of struggled to find criticism of the three estates. In fact, it's possible to read the General Prologue and not notice that it's an estate satire at all. And that has to do with the tone that Chaucer uses throughout the General Prologue. You may have noticed that Chaucer is very complimentary of most of the pilgrims that he describes in the General Prologue. Rather than pointing out problems with the three estates, Chaucer seems to be giving us examples of how great these different characters are. But I think we have to be a little careful when we read the General Prologue to try to separate out what Chaucer says from what he means. In other words, I think that there's a lot of irony in the General Prologue. And as a review, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term irony, but just in case you've forgotten specifically what it means, irony in literature always has to do with some kind of distance. In this case, a distance between what is said and what is meant. You can think of sarcasm, for example, as a form of irony. But I don't think Chaucer's being sarcastic in the General Prologue, though he is being ironic. And the way he manages that irony is actually one of the most interesting aspects of the General Prologue. He manages the irony of his descriptions through the use of a narrator. Now, Chaucer's not the first author to have to establish a narrator in a literary work, certainly. And he's not even the first author to present himself as a narrator. As I discussed in the last lecture, this narrator is definitely Chaucer. This isn't a third-person narrator. The characters later in the work will refer to the narrator as Chaucer. But the question is the narrator Chaucer the same as the author Chaucer? And this may be getting a little confusing, so let's look at a specific example from the General Prologue to see what I'm talking about. I'm actually going to skip over a few of the first portraits in the General Prologue and go straight to one of the most interesting ones, which is the portrait of the monk, starting in line 165 and following. And again, I will sort of translate as I go. He says, there was a monk, a really great one, an outrider, and this is a monk that has to do with the property outside the monastery, that loved hunting, a manly man, worthy to be an abbot. Full many a fine horse he had in stable, and when he rode, men could hear his bridle jangling in a whistling wind, as clear and also as loud as the chapel bell rings. That is, the bell at the monastery where the monk lives. The rule of St. Maur and of St. Benedict, because it was old and somewhat strict, this same monk let old things pass and decided instead to follow the new world. Now this requires a little bit of explanation. Monks live according to certain rules. These are rules that were established in the very early medieval period. And so Benedictine monks, for example, follow the rule of St. Benedict. And these are guidelines for living and behavior, etc. And what Chaucer's saying is, this monk doesn't believe in following that rule very strictly because it's so old, it's old-fashioned. He goes on to say, he gave naught of that text a pulled hen. In other words, he doesn't care anything about that text. The text that says that hunters are not holy men, or that a monk, when he is careless, is like a fish out of water, that is to say, a monk out of his cloister. But that same text he held as not worth an oyster, and I said his opinion was good. Why should he study and make himself crazy, always looking at books in a cloister, or work with his hands and labor as St. Augustine told him to? How shall the world be served? Let Augustine have his labor reserved to himself. For that reason he was an avid and hard rider. He had greyhounds as swift as birds in flight. All his desire was for riding and hunting for the hare. He would spare no cost. I saw his sleeves were fur-lined at the hand, with grey fur, and the finest fur in the land. And to fasten his hood under his chin, he had a strange pin made entirely of gold, a love knot in the larger end of the pin. There was. His head was bald as any, shone like any glass, and also his face, as if he had just been anointed. He was a very fat lord, and in good shape. He was plump, the footnote says. His eyes were protruding and rolling in his head that glowed like a furnace with a pot in it. His boots were supple, his horse was in great condition. Now surely he was a great churchman. He was not pale as some wasted-away ghost, and he loved a fat swan the best of any roasted meat. His saddle-horse was as brown as is a berry. Now, like with the Wife of Bath's portrait, we have a lot of different details here. We have some physical description. We know what he looks like. He's bald. He's fat. We know what his clothes look like. We know what he likes to eat. But probably more importantly, we know a lot about his attitudes. Chaucer seems to pay a lot of attention to how this monk feels about being a monk, about the rules that monks have to live by, for example. And that section near the middle of the portrait, where he talks about the monk's sort of refusal to follow some of these rules, is really interesting, because he says that he doesn't follow the rule of St. Benedict because it's somewhat old-fashioned, and he doesn't care anything for those texts, those rules that say, for example, that monks can't hunt, or that monks need to stay in their cloister. And then Chaucer says something really interesting. Chaucer says, remember this is the narrator speaking, says, and I said his opinion was good. In other words, and I agreed with him. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for a guy like this to have to spend all of his time looking at books or working with his hands just because some old saint said that's what you're supposed to do if you're a monk. And then Chaucer asked the question, how shall the world be served? In other words, how is the world served by this monk working in a garden? And it's a valid question, or rather it seems like a valid question. To a casual reader, if we're not paying close attention, we might follow along with Chaucer and say, yeah, he's right. Maybe monks should get out more, should do more stuff in the community, etc., because these old rules don't serve the world in any way. But there's one big problem with the question that Chaucer asked there, and I think Chaucer is well aware of the problem with the question. And the problem is that monks, by definition, are not supposed to serve the world. Monks are supposed to serve God, specifically. You know, in the medieval period, and this is still true today in the Catholic Church, but it was especially true in the medieval period, there are two types of clergy. There's what's known as the regular clergy, monks and nuns, and then the secular clergy. These are priests that work out in the community, that lead churches, for example. And that word, secular clergy, means the clergy of the world, as opposed to the clergy of the rule. And so what Chaucer's pointing out here is that this monk is sort of blurring the lines between the secular clergy and the regular clergy. Now, at this point, we might still think that Chaucer is being sincere here when he praises the monk. We might think, well, maybe Chaucer sees a way to reform the regular clergy. Maybe he thinks the regular clergy should be more active in the world. And there's possibly an argument for that. But as the portrait continues, I think it gets harder and harder for us to see the monk the way that Chaucer, the narrator, sees the monk, when he's described as very fat, for example. Well, monks are supposed to live lives of largely abstinence. They're not supposed to eat a lot. Eating a lot is a cardinal sin in the medieval world. It's called gluttony. So if this monk is fat, it means that he's been engaging in sinful behavior. And then we look at his clothes, for example. He's got a fur-lined cloak with the best fur in the land, which is maybe admirable, but monks are supposed to live in poverty. They're not supposed to own any property. And they're certainly not supposed to care whether their cloaks are fur-lined with gray fur or not. And then that last little detail that Chaucer gives us, that his favorite meat was roast swan. I mean, it's such a symbol of luxury, the idea of this monk feasting on roast swan. It certainly isn't in keeping with our ideas of what monks are supposed to be. They're supposed to deny themselves those kinds of pleasures, and swan would have been, in the medieval period, the most expensive kind of meat you could get. So when you put all of these details together, I think it becomes clear that Chaucer is painting a very critical portrait of the monk. But we're still left with that statement earlier in the portrait where he says, "But I said his opinion was good." In other words, Chaucer says, "I agree with him." Once we come to this conclusion, once we see that even though the narrator here says, "I agree with his opinion," that the portrait of the monk can't possibly be seen in an entirely positive light, I think at that point we're aware of the way the irony works in the General Prologue. And it's not just in this portrait, it's in lots of the portraits. In other words, we have this narrator, Chaucer, who seems to really agree with pretty much everybody. He's very slow to criticize anybody. And so when he describes the friar's behavior in the next portrait, and the friar is not just sort of a petty criminal, but also seems to be a very promiscuous figure. In other words, he seems to have a lot of encounters with the young women in the villages where he preaches. Chaucer doesn't criticize him for this. He again calls him a great friar. He's one of the best friars. And we see this over and over again. Chaucer, the narrator, saying, the wife of Bath was a great wife, and the miller's a great miller. But when we look at the portraits, we see the problems. And I think Chaucer, the author, sees the problems as well. And that's really the key to understanding the way the General Prologue works, is separating out the two Chaucers, Chaucer the author and Chaucer the narrator. And I think Chaucer has created this sort of unreliable narrator. In other words, a narrator that we can't trust, that we are supposed to disagree with, even though he's identified this narrator with himself. And that makes the General Prologue, I think, more entertaining to read. Now, I should point out that some of the irony in the General Prologue is even more subtle than we see in the monk's portrait. So, for example, a lot of students don't know what to make of the nun, or the prioress, who's described right before the monk. Her description seems to be almost entirely positive. She's described as being very attractive, as having great manners, of being very tender-hearted. There's a little bit maybe of implication that she's too concerned with her appearance, which is certainly a problem for a nun, but maybe not a fatal problem. But I think that we can see elements of irony in her portrait as well. We just have to look a little more closely. I'd draw your attention to one particular passage in her portrait, which begins at line 142 and following, I suppose. And again, I'll sort of translate, and it says, "But to speak of her conscience, she was so charitable and so piteous," in other words, she was so sympathetic, "that she would weep if she saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bleeding." And then the narrator goes on to say, "She had some small dogs that she fed with roasted flesh or milk and fine white bread. But she would sorely weep, she would cry, if one of them were dead, or if someone hit one of the dogs hit it harshly with a rod or a stick." Now, what's not to like here, right? We want people to be kind-hearted and be sympathetic and to care about animals. And so I don't think that the narrator is necessarily chastising her for being so tender-hearted that she would cry if she saw a mouse caught in a trap. But there is an interesting detail in those lines. and it's sort of a throwaway. In other words, Chaucer doesn't pay much attention to it. And it's when he mentions what she feeds her dogs, that she feeds the dogs roasted flesh or milk and fine white bread. And on one hand, maybe we can just see this as a mark of her concern for her dogs, that she feeds them with really good, rich food. But there's an interesting contrast here between the lines that just preceded these, that she would weep if she saw a mouse caught in a trap if it were dead or bleeding, and then the mention that she feeds her dogs roasted flesh. Now, flesh is a Middle English word that really just means meat, so it's roasted meat. It's maybe when we look at the word flesh, it has even more power. But I do think there's an interesting sort of contradiction here, this image of the nun who can't bear to see a mouse caught in a trap, but then is throwing these chunks of raw or roasted meat out to her dogs, with, of course, the, I guess, maybe ignoring the fact that roasted meat comes from an animal that had to have been killed in some way. Now, if we had that detail sort of by itself, in other words, if at the beginning of the portrait maybe Chaucer talked about her crying when she saw a mouse caught in a trap, and then much, much later in the portrait he mentioned that she had several small dogs and she would feed them roasted flesh, we might not read much into that. But by putting these two details right next to each other, this is a technique known as juxtaposition, which literally just means putting things side by side for the purposes of contrast. By putting that line about her feeding the dogs with roasted flesh right after, the next line after his mention that she cries when she sees a mouse caught in a trap, I think we pay more attention to that detail. In other words, the contrast between these two attitudes seems to point out maybe some inconsistency in the nun's character. Chaucer's actually a big fan of juxtaposition. It's a great technique for ironic effect. And he does it not just on the individual line level, but sometimes on the larger scale of putting portraits right next to each other. So maybe the most notable example here is at the very beginning of the General Prologue, when he describes the knight. And I should tell you, and this is a matter of some controversy, but most scholars believe that the knight is not an ironic portrait. In other words, that the knight is a character that Chaucer sincerely wants us to admire. And he's described as a very serious man and one who's gone off and fought in these battles far away. And these are religious battles. They're parts of the Crusades, in fact. And then he's come straight from the battlefield to go on the pilgrimage. He hasn't even changed clothes in between. He seems to be a very dedicated and devoted knight, and someone who has sort of real religious and honorable motivations. And then right after the knight's portrait, we get the squire, his son, who's someone in training to be a knight. But the squire, of course, is very, very different from the knight. The squire is described as being more interested in, well, sort of the ladies than he is in fighting battles. He has fought in battles, but they've all been sort of local battles, very close to England, and they've been political battles, not religious battles. They haven't been part of the Crusades. Rather, they've been parts of minor squabbles over land. He's described as being very, very clean and fresh and sort of good-looking, and that's a real contrast with the knight who is still wearing his dirty, rusty clothes from the battlefield. So by putting these two characters next to each other, I think Chaucer's inviting us to see the squire sort of through the lens of the knight. In other words, by asking us to look at the contrast between the squire and the knight. And it's in that contrast that we really understand what Chaucer's criticism of the squire is. In fact, Chaucer probably is saying that this is a squire who's more like a knight that you see in literature, like a knight from the Arthurian stories, for example, than a real knight, like he describes in the portrait of the knight. So he's juxtaposing individual characters there as well. Now, sometimes Chaucer is describing characters without irony. I mentioned that most critics see the knight as a sincere portrait. They also tend to see both the plowman and the parson as sincere portraits. The parson is described, he's the only clergyman who's described in entirely positive terms. He seems to be a humble man, a modest man whose only concern is taking care of the people in his parish. And then the plowman is a hard worker, a religious man, a devoted man, and a serious person as well. And it's interesting that these three sincere portraits happen to match up with the three estates. In other words, the knight becomes a positive example of nobility as compared to some of the more negative examples. The parson becomes a positive example of the clergy as compared to some of the more negative examples of the clergy. And then the plowman becomes a positive example of the peasantry. And whether this is purposeful or not, I guess we don't really know, but it does seem to work when you read the General Prologue, that each of these characters seems to sort of stand for what those estates should be like, and then we get lots of examples of what they shouldn't be like. Now, to really understand these characters, we will have to wait until we look at their tales. In other words, the General Prologue, while it's interesting in its own right, can't really stand by itself entirely. So we can't really understand what the squire is like until we read the squire's tale. We can't really understand what a character like the miller is like until we read the miller's tale. And we will be reading the miller's not the squire, but we'll be reading the miller's tale and the wife of Bath's tale. And we'll be looking back at their portraits in the General Prologue as sort of keys to understanding their character when we get to their tales as well. And it's that kind of integrity, structural integrity of the work, that everything sort of fits together, that makes the Canterbury Tales such an interesting work to read. But some of that's for a later lecture. For now, make sure you finish the General Prologue, try to pay attention to the irony in the portraits, try to understand what Chaucer is criticizing, if he's criticizing. If you have any questions about these portraits, let me know. Thank you.